We are now going to begin the second panel, and we're delighted to have an excellent panel, which will include Maggie Carter, Jaslyn Saxton, Sharon Block, Bradley Byrne, and Rachel Gresler. Our first witness is Maggie Carter. Ms. Carter began working at Starbucks part-time 4 years ago to get health benefits and pay while attending the University of Tennessee. Her store in Knoxville, Tennessee was the first Starbucks store in the South to unionize, and since then, Ms. Carter has helped workers at numerous other stores organize, and I'm delighted to have her here to talk about her experience. Ms. Carter, thanks for being with us. Turn the mic on and
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
So my name is Maggie Carter, and I'm a single mom to a beautiful 8-year-old boy named Colson. Being his mom is the absolute greatest gift of my life. He's why I ended up at Starbucks, the only place to offer me part-time benefits and what I thought would be flexible scheduling while in school. As a lesbian, I was also drawn to Starbucks by its reputation as a progressive employer. I started working at Starbucks in Jackson, Tennessee in May of 2019. I was paid $8.35 an hour. Then March of 2020 came, and it felt as if the world shut down. Just not at Starbucks. I worked consistently from day one of the pandemic because as a single mom, I didn't have a choice. In April 2020, I told my manager I needed to move from Jackson to Knoxville. It wasn't until 2 months later she responded, telling me I had only 48 hours to decide between quitting and being rehired in Knoxville, losing all of my seniority and benefits, or taking a leave of absence without pay and crossing my fingers to see if I would be transferred to a Knoxville store. Because of COVID, the company had frozen the normally easy transfer process. I couldn't risk losing my benefits, so I chose the second option, but it meant that I went without pay for 3 months. Luckily, I was able to begin work at a Knoxville store in August 2020. The whole situation was a punch to the gut, and the emotional impact of the disrespect I felt ultimately contributed to my belief in the need to organize a union. In October of 2021, Starbucks announced that starting pay would increase to $15 an hour almost a year later. I scoured the internet searching Starbucks wages, benefits, pay increases, and I learned about Starbucks workers organizing. I shared this information with my coworkers, and we decided to stand together to file for an election on Christmas Eve. We were proud to be the first store in the South. But it wasn't without an epic fight because Starbucks resisted us every step of the way. Just 5 days after announcing our union drive, our regional director drove to our store from out of state and was working alongside my partners, attempting to make drinks. It's the first time in my entire time with the company that I've met a regional director in person. Partners suddenly started getting disciplined for minor dress code violations or being 5 or so minutes late. Every day, it felt as if there was a concerted effort to build a case against partners who showed even the smallest bit of support for the union. Days prior to ballots being mailed out for the election, managers closed our store for hour-long periods, most during peak operating times, to hold impromptu captive audience meetings. It felt like the company was suddenly paying full attention to us and were willing to throw absolutely anything at us to deter us from organizing. We won our vote 1 year ago today, March 29th, 2022. Since then, we've made every attempt to try to bargain in good faith with the company. Starbucks walked out on our store's only scheduled bargaining session after just 30 minutes. On May 3rd, the company announced that partners who were organizing or had already unionized would not receive a series of important benefit increases that non-union stores would be granted. My partners, along with thousands of partners across the country, still do not have access to these benefits, nor do we have a company that is willing to sit across the table with us and bargain for them. This is part of my store's campaign story. But if you look to the 7,500 plus members of Starbucks Workers United, you will find thousands of stories that detail similar or more grotesque accounts of Starbucks behavior during their scorched earth union busting campaign. My coworker Michelle Eisen stated it perfectly when she testified before the House. It should not take an act of bravery to ensure you have a voice at work. Dated laws allow so much room for companies to harshly assert themselves. Unequal resources combined with unbalanced power dynamics ensure that the company's voice will often be louder than the collective voice of workers. Schultz has made a career selling the idea of offering benefits to part-time workers because he wanted to operate a different kind of company. I'm a single mother working tirelessly for this company for 4 years, and I'm certainly not alone in feeling nothing but left behind during a time where everything we knew about the world was uncertain. You cannot be pro-partner and anti-union. It's well past time for the company to bargain in good faith. Help us hold them accountable. Thank you for allowing partners to have a seat at this table alongside former CEO Howard Schultz, because that is significantly more than he was willing to offer. To Starbucks' new CEO, Laxman Narasimhan, you have an opportunity to chart a different course, to truly make Starbucks the different kind of company Schultz promised but failed epically to produce. This is a chance for your company to stop its unprecedented campaign of union busting and instead partner with us, your so-called partners, and our union to build a company that truly lives up to its stated progressive values. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Our next witness is Jason Saxton, who is a former Starbucks shift supervisor. Mr. Saxton started working at Starbucks in Augusta, Georgia in 2019. He and his coworkers successfully unionized their store in April 2022, and in July 22, after a 2-day strike, he was illegally fired by Starbucks. Mr. Saxton, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders. My name is Jason Saxton. I am a wrongfully fired Starbucks worker from Augusta, Georgia. I started with the company in 2019, hired on as a shift supervisor. In time, I became the go-to not only for baristas, but management as well. I was recognized for my dedication and hard work, as well as the positive and infectious energy and environment I created for partners and customers. I even won Partner of the Quarter. My time at Starbucks wasn't all bad. I met my amazing wife, who is now the mother of our 2-year-old, Ava. I got to be there for the customers who relied on us during the pandemic and support my coworkers whose families were also going through some really tough times. Being a disabled veteran with osteoarthritis of the spine from my time in the Coast Guard, I felt it was my duty to serve my country again, in order to make my workplace more equitable, but also so that my work family could have what they needed to survive. We faced many failed and broken systems working at Starbucks when we began to organize a union. We saw that Starbucks had failed at honoring its stated mission and values, so we chose to live up to them in challenging the status quo. In late 2021, when we started to hear about Starbucks workers in Buffalo organizing a union, I thought, we need this too. I reached out to Starbucks Workers United to see how we could get started organizing in our store and began talking to my coworkers. We kept organizing despite increasing retaliation and surveillance. The company sent higher-up managers to our store, and it felt like it was just to surveil us. The regional director, who drove down from Atlanta, was in our store regularly with the district manager. We were disciplined for minor things that happened in the store, like being written up for being 2 minutes late, which had never happened before. Terminations increased too. A partner who experienced sexual harassment from one of our managers was terminated after reporting it. They held captive audience meetings, they called them one-on-ones, for us to have all of the facts. But the partners were outnumbered every time. In these meetings, partners were being threatened with losing their benefits if they joined the union, which made them feel intimidated and scared. In February 2022, we heard about the Memphis 7, a high-profile case of retaliation and termination against a group of mostly workers of color. Their firing had a chilling effect on me and my coworkers as we saw the company betraying the very values and mission that these Memphis workers were upholding. Despite our fears, we were inspired by the courage and power of the Memphis 7 and filed for our election a month later in March 2022. A week after we filed, they replaced a sympathetic store manager, but it backfired as more people got on board with the union. In April, our store won our election by a landslide, 26-5. Despite all of the threats and intimidation. Starbucks retaliation and union busting ramped up even more after we won our election. We were constantly being watched, and managers listened in on our conversations through our headsets. Store hours were constantly changing, and hours kept getting cut. People were fired right on the shop floor. They fired 7 of our union members, 2 of them were shift supervisors. 2 partners requested medical and maternity leave. Management refused to sign off on their leave, and they were terminated. Several people quit, including my wife. Some of us were told that we should look for another job. In July, I led a 2-day unfair labor practice strike and delivered our demands. A month later, I was fired for supposedly being disruptive. I did not receive any write-up or discipline, and there was no investigation. I was fired after organizing like so many union leaders across the country. I have filed an unfair labor practice charge with the NLRB seeking to be reinstated at Starbucks. Starbucks and big corporations have a lot of power and money, and they are willing to pull out all the stops to deny workers a voice and a seat at the table in a union. That's why I'm thrilled to be here today to have witnessed firsthand Howard Schultz being held to account for his company's illegal behavior. We are coming together to demand better pay, affordable health coverage, and stronger safety procedures. I'm proud to be a leader of this new labor movement. We're taking on corporate power and fighting for all of us. One day, my daughter is going to be able to look up her dad on the internet and find out that I fought for a better future for every Starbucks worker and for all working people. And I know she'll also read that we took on one of the most powerful corporations and won. That's why I keep fighting, and that makes everything worth it.
Mr. Saxton, thank you very much. Our third witness is Sharon Block, a professor of practice and the executive director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School. For 20 years, she has held key labor policy positions across the legislative and executive branches of federal government, including here at the HELP Committee and in the NLRB. Ms. Block, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Cassidy, for inviting me to testify today. It feels a little bit like coming home. I want to make clear that first that I am testifying in my personal capacity and not as a representative of Harvard Law School. In light of my long service with the NLRB, I'd like to start my testimony by recognizing the great work done by the NLRB career staff with regard to the Starbucks campaign, handling hundreds of cases over the past 18 months. I know them firsthand to be consummate professionals and dedicated public servants. Next, I'd like to address the purpose of the National Labor Relations Act, so that we understand the consequences when an employer denies workers the rights guaranteed by the Act. The NLRA does not guarantee that workers will be represented by a union, or that if they are so represented, that they will secure particular outcomes at the bargaining table. Instead, it guarantees to them a fair process to decide for themselves whether they want to exercise these rights. It is always the workers who make these decisions. It is not the employer's decision. So thought of in this way, you can say that the NLRA establishes the rule of law for the workplace. And so the question for this hearing is whether Starbucks respected this workplace rule of law or has undermined the ability of workers to be treated fairly in their quest to decide for themselves whether they want union representation. I'd like to make three main points in the remainder of my testimony. First, the scope of Starbucks violations alleged and found so far is beyond the scope of the anti-union campaigns that I have witnessed during my career as a labor lawyer. Second, these violations should not be understood as isolated acts, but rather should be viewed as a coordinated campaign to stifle union activity across the company. Finally, it is critical that this kind of egregious conduct is taken seriously, because otherwise it will send a message to workers across the economy that their rights are as disposable as a paper Starbucks cup. First, I'll address the scope of the violations. As you have heard already, Starbucks is facing more than 500 allegations that it has violated the NLRA, and already career board agents have found merit in more than half of those charges. In addition, 4 board members from both political parties and 7 career administrative law judges have concluded that Starbucks has committed violations of the Act. While it sadly has become quite common for companies to respond hostilely and often unlawfully to organizing campaigns by their workers, I'm not aware of another company in recent years that has had this many allegations leveled against it or this many allegations found to have merit. The egregiousness of many of the violations also makes this campaign stand out. For decades, board law has deemed the firing of pro-union workers during an organizing campaign as a hallmark violation. That is, a violation that is likely to have significant impact not just on the worker who is fired, but also on the organizing rights of coworkers. Already, the General Counsel and ALJs have found more than 20 Starbucks employees have been fired because of their union activity. These discharges and other hallmark violations found is conduct that goes to the very heart of workers' rights under the Act. And in the words of the ALJ who reviewed Starbucks' anti-union campaign in Buffalo, Starbucks has engaged in egregious and widespread misconduct, demonstrating a general disregard for employees' fundamental rights. That observation leads to my second point. What has happened at Starbucks is not just a collection of individual violations. It looks more like a company campaign to stop the workers' campaign in its tracks. Each time the company commits a new violation in a new location or at a new stage in the union's campaign, it is communicating to all of its workers that the rights accorded to them by the law can be defeated, that the company has the resources, the will, and the stamina to undermine the exercise of their rights at every turn. Therefore, I'm also concerned about the wider message that Starbucks' vast anti-union campaign sends. Workers across the country, especially low-wage workers, have also been inspired by what the Starbucks baristas have achieved over the past 18 months. But what do these workers and the public think when they see that Starbucks is willing to break the law that protects these rights hundreds of times? I commend the committee for holding this hearing to show that you take seriously workers' rights to organize and to sit at a bargaining table if they choose, even if their employer is a huge company that really doesn't want them to have a union. It's a bedrock of our democracy that the law applies to everyone, including the most powerful. So I believe that much is at stake in ensuring that Starbucks workers' rights to unionize are protected and respected. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Block. Senator Cassidy is voting, so I'm going to introduce his witnesses. Former Representative Bradley Byrne served 4 terms in Congress and has more than 30 years of experience as a labor and employment attorney in private practice. Mr. Byrne, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've submitted a written statement. I won't read that to you. I do not represent Starbucks. I do not have a position about whether they have or have not committed unfair labor practice violations. I do not have a position on whether they should or should not be organized. I believe that it's up to the workers, and I trust the wisdom of the workers at the Starbucks stores to make those decisions in appropriately conducted elections. I'm here because I represent a whistleblower, a longtime employee, professional employee at the National Labor Relations Board, who has come forward to the Inspector General of the National Labor Relations Board with information that there have been significant irregularities, violations of the neutrality of the organization of the agency during at least one such election. Now, why does that matter? The process that we follow in these elections is very important because, as the previous speaker said, it's to make sure that the employees make a free and uncoerced decision. It's not to protect the management of the company, it's not to protect the union, and it's certainly not to protect the NLRB. The NLRB is required to conduct what we call laboratory conditions from the time a petition is filed until the time you have an election. That means you've got to make sure that the voting environment is free, that there isn't any coercion, and most especially in this case, that the NLRB isn't putting its finger down on one side or the other. They shouldn't favor the employer, they shouldn't favor the union. They should be professional and neutral in all cases. And in my experience, the vast majority of the employees of the NLRB do exactly that. Unfortunately, we know that in at least one case that was violated. It was violated egregiously, and a hearing officer found 4 different violations. Now, here's the problem with all that. If you do something that challenges the integrity of the process, you've challenged the integrity of the vote. And if you challenge the integrity of the vote, you've challenged the integrity of the entire system. Because remember, it's there to give the employees the final decision, not the company, and certainly not the union. So what I would like for this committee to do is to use its oversight authority, which is considerable, to look into what happened, not just in this one case, but to determine if there is a pattern in practice at the NLRB of violating their neutrality obligation. And if there is a pattern in practice, is that pattern in practice being directed from people in higher echelons of the agency? I am very concerned by public statements, public positions taken by the General Counsel of the NLRB. The General Counsel is a political appointee. There's nothing wrong with that. That's true when you have Republican presidents, just like it's true when you have a Democrat president. But whether you're a Democratic-appointed NLRB general counsel or Republican-appointed, you have an obligation to maintain that neutrality. You have an obligation to follow the law. What this general counsel has done is attack the process for elections altogether. She wants to do away with elections. That greatly disturbs me. It flies in the face of long-settled law, and it also flies in the face of what I've been hearing a lot about recently, and that is workplace democracy, workforce democracy. Well, if we believe in workplace democracy, we ought to give employees the right to vote as to whether or not they want a union. If they do, as they have done in some of these Starbucks elections, that's the law. They get to have a union represent them. But in many cases, they vote no. In the vast majority of cases where I represented an employer representation election, the employees chose not to have a union represent them. Fine. Whichever way they vote is good. But they ought to have the right to hear both sides of the story, which they won't have if they don't have an election. And they ought to have the ability to walk into a secret place and cast a secret vote so that no one is coercing them to vote whichever way they want to vote. So I asked this committee and the Congress to look at this very carefully because of the seriousness of the situation. It should be all of our concern that we make sure that we have true integrity in these elections so that the result is final and fair. I thank you for the opportunity to be here and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Byrne, thank you very much. Rachel Gresler is a senior research fellow in economics at the Heritage Foundation. She previously served as a senior economist at the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. Ms. Gresler, thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Is your mic on?
Yes.
Okay, hold it close.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. First, I want to recognize the important role that unions have played in U.S. history in securing important worker safety protections, just wages, and giving workers a previously unheard voice. Many of the things that unions fought for are now protected by law, and the globally competitive economy has empowered individual workers and ultimately weakened unions' advantages. For example, when the only cars that Americans could buy were those that were produced in the U.S., the United Auto Workers Union could impose above-market compensation. While that benefited union workers in the short run, it meant more expensive cars, fewer people able to afford them, and fewer workers needed to produce them. When foreign competition entered and unions maintained their excessive compensation demands, automakers began shuttering their doors, and domestic auto production today is 1/3 of what it used to be 2 decades ago. In addition to shifting to more service-oriented jobs, American workers have become more educated and more mobile. The average worker changes jobs 12 times throughout their career, which means pensions built on decades of service are less desirable. And rigid pay scales may work for 9-to-5 jobs where everybody produces 20 widgets a day, but few jobs today are so routine, and most workers want to be paid based on what they contribute. Consequently, union advantages have been waning. Since 2007, non-union wages have increased 56%, while union wages have increased only 41%. And union pensions have recklessly promised $677 billion in pension benefits that they haven't set aside to pay. Instead of adapting to provide new services that workers value, unions have turned to political force and inciting animosity. Depicting company management as 12-foot diseased rats is dehumanizing and destructive. Most people want to be part of a team, not a battle. In fact, positive workplace relationships are the biggest indicator of employee satisfaction. Most people also don't want their money taken to pay for things that they don't value. But many unions spend more money on politics than they do representing workers. A recent study found that only 16% of teachers' union dues go to the local union that bargains on their behalf. The rest goes to the state and the national unions that spend a lot of that money on politics. Unionization hit an all-time low of 10.1% last year, And in part, that's because employers can be more responsive and accommodating to workers' desires without a union dictating what they can and can't do. Instead of wooing workers, unions are trying to forcibly reverse their decline through laws that would take away workers' privacy, their secret ballot elections, their right to work without paying a union, and the ability to be their own boss. But instead of forcing workers into one-size-fits-all unions, alternative worker organizations could benefit more workers. For example, Major League Sports bargain collectively for some things, but players are able to negotiate their own salaries. Professional organizations like the Freelancers Union provide educational services, and they bring workers together to pool benefits. And worker choice models would allow more workers who want to be in a union to have that option while not forcing anybody who doesn't want to be in the union. The Employees' Right Act would secure fundamental rights like privacy, secret ballot elections. It would elevate the voices and the opportunities of union and non-union workers alike. And it would also protect the livelihoods of 59 million Americans who participate in independent work. It would also preserve the small business franchise model. The recent shortage of workers and a longer-term decline in labor force participation is troubling for the economy and civil society. To help more people find meaningful and productive work, policymakers should expand apprenticeship opportunities, enable more portable benefits, and end unnecessary regulations that prevent employers from offering more flexible and generous benefits. Additionally, it is the NLRB's job, not Congress's, to investigate unfair labor practices and to render consistent and impartial decisions. It's also the NLRB's job to oversee fair elections and to protect workers' and employers' free speech rights. I don't know about specific unfair labor practice charges at Starbucks or any of the roughly 18,000 unfair labor practices filed with the NLRB last year, but I do know from my work advocating for workplace flexibility that Starbucks has been a leader in expanding benefits like paid family leave and providing college tuition and high starting wages. The fact that their turnover rate is less than half the industry average suggests that they're doing something right. Running a business and attracting and retaining workers isn't easy, and employers shouldn't have to fear congressional harassment if they don't want a union coming between them and their workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me begin my questioning with Ms. Carter and Mr. Saxton. You have heard, I suspect, Mr. Schultz saying that he obeys the law. He respects the right of workers to organize if that is what he wants. Starbucks does not engage in union busting. Ms. Carter, what is your observation about that?
My observation is that that is not my experience while working in a store that was unionizing. Thank you for your question, Chairman. So, we were forced to go through multiple captive audience meetings in our store, and our store was the only one to stay open throughout the entirety of the pandemic. Unfortunately, because of a captive audience meeting, a member of management who traveled to our store from, I don't know where, I had never met them before, gave multiple partners COVID in this meeting, and we had to shut down for 5 days. Now, that's a little bit of union busting and outside experiences, but kind of crazy to go through.
Did workers have any option about whether or not they would undergo this meeting with the Starbucks executive?
We were scheduled for that meeting, and it actually was our very first one, so we weren't told at this point in time that we didn't have to attend. So it was very much not an option.
Okay. Let me get to Mr. Saxton. You heard what Mr. Schultz said. What do you think?
Thank you for your question, Senator. That hasn't been my experience. In my store, when we filed, they fired our store manager. He was a very well-liked store manager. He actually helped in our organizing effort once he was fired. After that, they brought in an interim store manager and a store manager team to make our store more efficient. That making our store more efficient resulted in us constantly coming into work with everything moved around. So every single day we had to relearn where everything was. With that, the interim store manager would take notes about what she would hear or see on the floor, and she'd write down partners' names. We didn't find out until after we had our election that those people that the names that she had written down were going to be written up and or fired. So
What I'm hearing from you is you didn't quite accept Mr. Schultz's view that he is not engaged in anti-union activity.
They have definitely engaged in anti-union activity.
Let me get to Ms. Block. If I heard you correctly, I think you indicated that what you are seeing at Starbucks is unprecedented and that in modern history, and that what Starbucks is doing is also sending a signal to the corporate world that, in a sense, if they can get away with this, other corporations can as well. Am I right on that?
Yes, I think that's a fair interpretation of how this campaign may be perceived. And in my mind, most importantly, among other low-wage workers that work for large corporations that have the resources to engage in this kind of drawn-out, long litigation over their activity during an organizing campaign.
What is the purpose, do you think, of these long, never-ending efforts on the part of companies? Why do they do that?
I mean, I try not to speculate on other people's motives, but, I am concerned that we are seeing now fewer petitions being filed by other Starbucks employees. There can be lots of reasons for that, so I think, time will tell. But, as other witnesses and as other members of the committee have indicated, there is necessarily a huge power imbalance between workers and the company. And so there's this ability to play things out over a long time just exacerbates that kind of power imbalance.
Okay. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Byrne, you represent a constituent of mine who's bravely provided information to the NLRB Inspector General of misconduct that she witnessed during the representation election at a Starbucks in Overland, Kansas. And specifically, a hearing officer found there was substantial disparity between the communications the region shared with Starbucks and the communications the region shared with the union. What makes this an issue?
Well, you're supposed to be neutral. And so if you're having communications with the union about an issue, you need to have communications with management as well. And if you're not having that even communication, then clearly you're favoring one side over the other.
Now, some of the communications seem to me fairly benign, but again, I'm not a lawyer. But I gather it has to be even keel. Whatever you do for one, you have to do for the other.
That's correct. So one of the things that came out in that is that the labor board agent actually allowed the union to bring 2 people to vote at the board's office. And this was a mail-in election where you had a stipulated agreement. So the communications weren't about some small things. They were about big things, i.e. the vote.
So the stipulation that you shall mail in is really kind of ironclad. And what may seem just kind of like an accommodation, really they should have said, no, we can't. You got to go down the street. You got to put in a mailbox or something like that.
A stipulated agreement is the law of the case. They have to follow that. Now, if they want to vary it, you go to both sides and say we need to vary it as to this employee or that employee. But you don't just unilaterally do it after having a conversation with the union and you haven't had any conversation with the company.
So the guy or gal who might forget to mail it, and I forget to mail bills all the time, that would take out that variable of whether or not they would actually remember to put it in the mailbox or don't have stamps at home or whatever the variable would be. I kind of get that. Let me ask you this. Can you tell us about records brought forward by your client that implicates a pattern and practice that the union received accommodations by NLRB in other regions, not just Kansas?
Senator, let me be very careful how I say this. There is a subpoena that has been issued to my client by the House Committee. We're in the process of reviewing that and complying with it. I can say, without going into the details of it, that there are documents in there that would indicate that the sort of thing that happened at this one particular election has happened in other elections as well. So there is a basis to determine whether or not there has been a pattern of practice, not just in Starbucks cases, although the House subpoena was limited to Starbucks cases, but if it's happened in Starbucks cases, is it happening in other cases across the country?
Let me ask you this. Much has been made about the number of filings of unfair labor practices by people seeking to unionize against Starbucks. And yet NLRB, in a letter that I submitted for the record earlier, in other documents, has stated that over half of unfair labor practices are dismissed or withdrawn. As a labor lawyer, can you speak to the tactical use of unfair labor practice complaints in an organizing campaign?
In my experience, the union files unfair labor practice charges, multiple unfair labor practice charges in every election, and it's part of their strategy for handling it. And as you said, the vast majority of them are thrown out. They don't even get to the point of having a hearing because they didn't have any basis in the first place. So it's a pattern that the union follows to try to intimidate the employer and try to eat up the time in the election.
Ms. Gresler, Republicans made it pretty clear that we support the right to unionize. But you point out that the labor laws we have are like sometimes 100 years old. And yet you promote some reforms that would modernize it, if you will. And you mentioned, for example, Major League Baseball, a special case, but in which merit actually dictates wages along with the baseline of benefits. Can you just quickly summarize some other things that if we were to come together on a bipartisan basis, you would recommend that we do to help people who seek to unionize, but to update the whole concept?
Yeah, and there I think the focus has to be on the workers and their choices. And so they may choose to have an organizational structure that allows them to pull together and say these certain benefits are important to all of us and we want to have the same level of them. But there are other things that we want to be able to negotiate more flexibly. And that could also happen across a big company that has multiple different stores in different states that is facing different conditions. And I think the importance there is letting the workers have the choice to do that. And so right-to-work states allow this, but they also, in those states, have representation on everybody. So even if the worker isn't paying into the union, they are represented by the union. Now, the union would say that that's a free rider problem. So you could eliminate that by saying the union does not have to represent you if you're not paying them. So if you want that representation, you've got to pay. But if you don't want it, you can be on your own and you can negotiate by yourself, or you can have a separate type of negotiation, but just having the choice actually be focused on the worker themselves.
Gotcha. With that, I yield.
Thank you. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair Sanders and Ranking Member, and welcome to all of you. It's really, I'm glad to see you here, and I want to thank you in particular, the Starbucks organizers for being here. Ms. Carter, I understand you organized one of the first stores in the South for the Starbucks workers, and I wanted to ask you something. Mr. Schultz talked repeatedly this morning about this partner relationship that he says that he has with his employees, and I'm just wondering, from your experience, how do you have a partnership with hundreds of thousands of people, and when you were doing the organizing in your when you were doing your organizing, like what did you find? Why were people wanting to be part of a bargaining unit?
Thank you so much for your question, Senator. So it's about the rules and regulations that are in place and how we are actually able to service the customer. Right. Throughout COVID, we really saw a decline in maintenance in our stores. We really saw a decline in upkeep. And frankly, when you report these concerns to your manager, it just really feels like you're talking sometimes to a wall, as if you're just not getting any response. So that was a huge catalyst to why we wanted to organize, but also just the wages and rent rising in our state. It's just not something that worked for us, and also benefits are just too expensive for us to actually be able to use. So rather than forego a paycheck, we just choose not to have health insurance. So those are a lot of the reasons why we chose to organize. And I'll say Howard Schultz does not feel like a partner to me as well.
Thank you. Mr. Saxton, was there anything, I'd like to know what you'd like to add to this. And I'm particularly interested in the challenges that folks have dealing with schedules that are uncertain and unpredictable. And, you have maybe a promise of some hours that you then don't get. And how would being part of a bargaining unit help you deal with those kinds of challenges as a worker?
Thank you. To answer the first question, some of the challenges that we faced were when I talked to some of my coworkers, they overwhelmingly were talking about the training. The training is 1 week where you're learning everything, and then 1 week where you're practicing everything. And then for shift supervisors, you go through the same barista training, and then you do shift supervisor training, which functions the same way. Then scheduling was a huge thing, and this kind of goes into your second question. So I currently have at my store someone who used to get 25 hours a week. They are a very much so a supporter of our union. They have been reduced down to 5 hours a week. I think that speaks for itself. If they really want to be partners with us, they'd hear those concerns, and they make those changes, and they'd feel so. Starbucks has an empty seat that they leave at the shareholder table for their partners. They fill that seat and hear what we have to say.
Thank you. Ms. Block, earlier this morning when we were talking with Mr. Schultz, several of us were pressing him on this disparity in disparities in which the unionized folks were being treated versus the non-unionized people were being treated. I particularly was talking about this ability for the unionized shops to be able to access the credit card tipping mechanism. Mr. Schultz said that his understanding of the law was that he could not do that. Now, when I questioned him, he shifted a little bit and he said, well, actually, it's our preference not to do that. Could you just address this issue? Could you address this issue?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I think as Mr. Schultz eventually was sort of circling around, once the union waived its right to bargain over those particular benefits,
right,
it would not have been unlawful for Starbucks, at least what I can tell from the information that's become public, would not have been unlawful for Starbucks to grant those benefits to the stores that had unionized. But there's another dimension too in the allegations that in fact withholding those benefits was itself an unfair labor practice. And that goes to the question of why they made that judgment. So if it isn't accurate that the law precluded them from providing those benefits, then you say, well, then what was the reason? And if the reason for withholding those benefits was to retaliate against workers for having a union, to intimidate them in how they exercise that right, then that crosses the line from just not being accurate sense of the law to being an unfair labor practice. And so that's the question that will now be before the board.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Just a few more questions. Recently, Starbucks raised their minimum wage, I suspect, in response to union organizing. But tell me, and certainly it's not just people working in Starbucks, what's it like to try to get by on $15 an hour or $16 an hour, number one? And number two, picking up on Senator Smith's question about scheduling, do people know if they're going to have 40 hours or 30 hours or 20 hours? If I go to work, how many hours am I going to be working in a week? Ms. Carter?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Sanders. So to address your first question, $15 an hour is not enough to pay bills and actually survive in this world today as we know it. We often struggle. One of the main things I hear from my partners is I can't pay my light bill and put gas in my car at the same time, or I can't put gas in my car at the same time and get groceries. So just imagine having to ration the most important things that you need to survive day in and day out. Another point that I'm really glad you brought up is the hour requirement in order to obtain benefits. In my 4 years at the company, I've never had a problem qualifying for benefits until now suddenly. I actually just was taken off of Starbucks benefit policies because I have not been scheduled the appropriate hours or anywhere close to my availability for the better part of
Explain that to the world out here. What does that mean?
Yeah, so basically...
So if I am your supervisor, I can reduce your work week, And because I've reduced your work week, you now lose your benefits? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir. We have an hour requirement per week. It's 20 hours per week. The threshold was lowered due to COVID. However, that has now since, I believe, been removed. Because of that, my hours were cut basically since around a little bit before Christmas last year. And so I actually just recently lost my benefits because of that hour requirement. Having your benefits tied to your hours when you don't get to determine the hours you work doesn't really seem conducive, in my opinion.
All right, let me go to Mr. Saxton. People have to pay rent, they have to deal with all the needs of a family. How do you do a budget if you don't know exactly how many hours you're going to be working and what kind of paycheck you get at the end of the month?
I mean, you simply can't do a budget when you don't know. Like I said, there was a partner at my store whose hours went down from 25 to 5. They've now had to get a second job. Even with that, the scheduling around their second job, and with Starbucks, how do you have a second job if you just don't know? Starbucks puts out its new schedule every 3 weeks. So 1 week you can have 25. The next week you could have 10. The week after that you could have 15.
That's theoretical. Is that common? Does that really happen?
That is very common. That is very common.
So how do you know if you're going to be able to pay your rent if you got 10 hours?
You get a second job, you do DoorDash, which many of my partners in my store have had to do.
All right, tell me about healthcare. I don't want to misquote Mr. Schultz, but he talked something about comprehensive health benefits. When I hear that, I think that people have universal health care, that they can walk in the doctor, not have to take out their credit card, or what's going on with health care? Ms. Carter or Mr. Saxton, jump in.
So with healthcare, I actually had healthcare with Starbucks. I had myself, my wife, and my daughter covered. The thing about the coverage is it's offered in tiers. So there's like the gold, silver, and bronze. These tiers, you still have to pay your copay. You still have to take out your card when you go to the doctor.
How much is copay, out of curiosity, or does it depend on the?
It depends on the level that you pick.
Okay. So would I be correct in assuming that if I'm working 10 hours a week, well, first of all, I work 10 hours a week or 15 hours a week, I don't get that benefit. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. And if I'm working 20 hours a week, I'm not making enough money to pay the co-payment or the premium, right?
Correct.
You want to elaborate on this? Doesn't sound like maybe it's quite the comprehensive benefit that
It's
Mr.
not
Schultz.
very comprehensive at all. So with every wage increase, they increase how much you have to pay into the health insurance. So that means more of your check is coming out for subpar health insurance that doesn't cover everything. So I have been reduced to going back to just the VA. Besides my firing, I've had to go back to the VA to get things that Starbucks health insurance would not cover.
It would seem to me that if I was sitting where you were sitting and fighting for a union, one of my demands would be consistent and reasonable scheduling that I had some input to. Is that true?
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Yeah, that is absolutely one of our proposals, is to have better consistent scheduling, and also, just making sure that, well, I don't want to misspeak about the bargaining proposals, but I do know that having that consistent schedule is definitely something that we are fighting for in this movement, because, if our benefits are tied to it, we need to know that we can get those hours and not have to have this ridiculous availability that, like Jason said, keeps you from actually pursuing a second job or pursuing some other form of income.
What does this availability mean? What does that mean?
So I believe it was, I don't want to misquote what around the time that this was instituted, but it doesn't apply to union stores. But for non-union stores, I believe you have to have 180% of your hours available on top of the availability that you have. If you want to, so say for example, you want to work 12 hours a week, you have to have 18 hours available. If you want to work, I'm bad at math, so I'm just going to use that example. But yeah, that pretty much explains it.
Okay. Anything more that you would like to add? Mr. Saxon, Ms. Carter? No? Okay. All right, on behalf of the committee, let me thank all of our panelists for your testimony. We appreciate it very much. This is the end of our hearing. And for any senators who wish to ask additional questions, questions for the record will be due in 10 business days, April 12th by 5 p.m. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 statements from stakeholder groups in support of Starbucks workers in their fight to join a union freely and fairly. The committee stands adjourned.